Assalamualaikum. My name is Fatiha, and now I will explain about the first question, which is the important functions of governments. Firstly, the government will create a business environment which encourages competition among producers. This can increase efficiency in the utilization of resources and produce better quality products. Second, the government will redistribute income and wealth among the population. In other words, the government will control disparity between the rich and the poor through taxation and transfer payments. Third, governments will provide legal framework and social framework for the effective operation of an economy. The legal framework will include the legal status of business enterprises, private ownership, and others.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Today, I am going to explain about three types of national budget. So, the first one is a balanced budget. A balanced budget occurs when the government's total expenditure is equal to its total revenue. According to economists, this type of budget is based on the idea that the government's expenditure should not exceed its revenue. The estimated expenditure must be equal to the expected income in a particular financial year. Economists believe that it is simple to balance the estimated expenditure and expected revenues, but when it comes to the actual situation, this balance is probably tough to achieve. Next, we move on to the surplus budget. A surplus budget occurs when the government's total revenue is more than its total expenditure. A government with a surplus budget can pay up its debts or earn interest on funds. This type of budget signifies that the government earnings from taxes are more than the money that the government spends on public welfare. A surplus budget indicates that the government has extra money, which means that these funds can be allocated to pay national debts, which slashes the interest payable and helps the economy in the long run. The next one is deficit budget. A deficit budget occurs when the government's total expenditure is more than its total revenue. A government with a deficit budget must either borrow from external or internal sources or use national reserves. According to analysts, a deficit budget suits developing economies, and at times of recession, this type of budget helps generate extra demand and spur the rate of economic growth.
Moving on to the next question, there are three types of tax structure, which are the proportional tax, progressive tax, and regressive tax. But for this part, I will only explain two types of tax structure. Firstly, proportional tax. A proportional tax is a tax which is imposed at the same rate for all income levels. It remains constant regardless of whether income increases or decreases. You can see on the table that the tax rate imposed remains the same even when the income is different. Second, progressive tax. A progressive tax is a tax rate which goes on increasing with income. From the table, we can see that as the income goes higher, the higher the percentage of tax.
So I'll be talking about question D, about explain how central bank employs instruments of monetary policy. As you all know, there are two types of government policy, which are monetary policy and fiscal policy. But today we'll be talking about monetary policy, and monetary policy is a policy employing the central bank's control of the money supply in this government. And there are also two types of monetary policy, which are expansionary monetary policy and also contractionary monetary policy. Alright, in monetary policy, there are two types of instruments, which are quantitative instruments of monetary policy and also qualitative instruments of monetary policy. But we'll be talking about quantitative instruments only today. There are four types of instruments in quantitative instruments, which are open market operation, legal cash reserve requirement, and also bank or discount rate and fundings. Alright, the first one is open market or operation, or in short OMO. Alright, in this operation, the central bank can influence the cash reserves of commercial banks through this operation. And this operation includes buying and selling of government securities by the central bank to influence the cash reserves in commercial banks. And during inflation, the central bank will reduce the cash reserves of commercial banks by selling securities so that it will decrease the money supply of the government. And by then, during unemployment, the central bank will buy securities and increase cash reserves that will increase the money supply of the government. Alright, the next instrument is legal cash reserve requirement. Alright, legal cash reserve requirement is the minimum amount of cash required by all commercial banks to be kept in the central bank. And during inflation, the central bank will raise the minimum legal cash reserve ratio in order to restrain credit recreation by commercial banks that will at the end will reduce the money supply in the government. And the last one is bank or discount rate. Bank or discount rate is the interest rates that the central bank charges on loans or of reserves to banks. And changes in the bank rate or discount rate will affect the cost at which borrowing can be made available to banks from the central bank. And if the central bank increases its bank rates, the interest rate on borrowing becomes more expensive, and this will lead to a decrease in the demand for loans. And this also will increase in bank rates is a tool in contractionary monetary policy that is usually used in during inflation.
For this question, I will explain about two measures of fiscal policy that can control unemployment. The first one is decrease in taxes. Taxation is one of the primary fiscal policy tools that the government has at its disposal to reduce unemployment. High taxes means consumers have less disposable income, which results in less consumption. When consumers buy less, business takes in less revenue and is less likely to hire new workers or may even lay off workers to reduce costs. Cutting taxes is a common method the government used to spark economic growth and reduce unemployment. Tax cuts put more money into the hands of consumers, which can lead to increase of revenue in the business. The second measure is increasing government expenditure. For this type of measure, an increase in government expenditure will directly affect aggregate demand. With an increase in aggregate demand, there will also be an increase in real GDP. If firms produce more, there will be an increase in demand for workers and therefore lower the demand for unemployment. Also, with higher aggregate demand and strong economic growth, fewer firms will go bankrupt, meaning fewer job losses and thus unemployment can be reduced. If the government funds new public works programs such as building infrastructures like roads or train systems, it can create jobs that serve to reduce unemployment and increase disposable income and spending.
I'm going to explain question F, which is three measures of monetary policy that can control inflation. First of all, what is inflation? Inflation is when there is so much money in the economy that make all the price of goods increase rapidly. So, central bank will take three measures to control the inflation. Firstly, open market operation. Open market operation includes the buying and selling of government securities by central bank. It is to influence the cash reserve in commercial banks. So the central bank has a government securities or bonds that they will sell to people so that the money in the economy decrease. So the ability for them to spend money also decrease, which could control the inflation. Next is legal cash reserve requirement. The instrument of variable minimum legal cash reserve ratio requirement affects the total amount of the reserve of commercial banks. It also affects the amount of excess cash reserve in commercial banks, which reflects their ability to lend. So the central bank will decide on how many the cash reserve will be kept in the commercial banks. If the central bank asks them to increase the cash reserve, the money in the economy will decrease. Therefore,
inflation could be controlled. Lastly, bank or discount rate. The discount rate or bank rate is the interest rate the central bank charges on loans of reserve to banks. Change in the bank rate or discount rate affect the cost of at which borrowing can be made available to banks from the central banks. So, bank or discount rate is an interest rate that people need to pay when they borrowing money. So when central bank increase the interest rate, people will need to pay more as they pay their loans that they took out from the banks. So because of this, their ability to buy goods will decrease. Therefore, the inflation could be controlled. These three actions that the central bank took to fight the inflation is called contractionary monetary policy. What these three actions have in common is that they all reduce amount of money that's circulating in the economy. When people don't have as much money they had before, they don't have the ability to spend the money, and the prices of goods need to be decreased. If not, no one's going to buy the goods. Then, as a result, the inflation is kept under control. That's all from me. And remember, econs is easy. Thank you.